Hi everyone, receive a warm greeting. Welcome to the Self Knowledge course. Today we arrive at topic number 27, where we are going to be studying a very important technique to advance in the work of psychological death. This technique that will allow us to dissolve our ego, our psychological eyes, is the technique of the details. You're going to see that by practicing this technique, you will be able to completely dissolve any psychological eye. It doesn't matter what. If you dissolve them from the details, you will be able to experience the real changes that will start to be taking place inside you. And as we apply this technique, we are also going to see clear results in the process of balancing of our energetic centers, right? By practicing psychological death moment to moment in all these details, this balance of our centers will allow us to achieve what is known as the perfect chastity, right? So we'll be able to be purifying our energy to be able to make superior creations with it. Well, this chapter that we are going to be studying today is esoterically titled Death. Well, why? Because the moment a person begins to disintegrate their psychological defects, they begin to step outside the circle in which all humanity is currently caught up, right? They begin to die to the ego, and at the same time, their spiritual side begins to awaken, begins to come into life. And the things of the ego no longer attract them, right? All the forces that move humanity, greed, lust, envy, vanity, pride, anxiety, and so on, will be gradually losing their meaning for that person. And that person will discover something far greater within themselves. They begin to perceive a deeper, more transcendental purpose for their existence. So when such a person is invited to commit some misdeed, others may say, don't bother with that person, he's already dead. And in a way, they are right, because he no longer follows the path of ordinary humanity. To those who still want to live inside the ego and for the things of the ego, we may appear to be dead, even insensitive. But the truth is that we are no longer reacting mechanically to the desires of our ego. Instead, our attention is fixed on awakening that divine essence within us, which is what we truly are, right? And we understand the need to stop misusing our so valuable energy to make superior creations with that energy. Okay, so we also must reflect on the fact that in every human being there exists a divine spark. Some traditions call that spark the soul, right? Others call it the Buddhata, and still others call that essence, that divine spark essence, right? The names may vary, but depending on the culture, right? But the reality is the same. It is that sacred spark that lives deep inside of us. It is this spark that moves us, that inspires us, that gives us strength to begin a spiritual path and to follow it, right? It is what awakens in us that yearning to seek for spiritual things, that longing to understand who we really are, and that give us like the will to truly work on ourselves. But this essence that we all are, this soul that we all carry within, is at the moment trapped. It is like imprisoned in all our different ways of being or psychological defects, in all those psychological elements that we all have, which together form what is esoterically called the ego. There is a small portion in each one of them of our essence. And these defects are the very things that prevents that essence from expressing itself freely. They are what stop us from thinking, feeling, and acting consciously. because they take over the voice and the control of the human machine, right? However, as we begin to work on ourselves, on disintegrating those psychological defects, something changes. Little by little, the divine essence grows because every time that we ask for death for any of those psychological defects, that small portion that was trapped in it, it is liberated, right? And that essence is going to be growing, right? It's going to be strengthening, and it starts to manifest in us with greater clarity and greater force each time. And in that process, that essence will gradually become a true soul, right? And well, there is yet another divine spark within us, another part of a spirit, which we call the Divine Mother. Just as each one of us has an inner father to which we pray, right? To which we ask for guidance, for wisdom. Well, that inner father actually represents the wisdom of our consciousness. So too do we all have our own inner mother. And the sacred mission of that part of our consciousness is to disintegrate all those psychological defects that we have observed and that we have understood. And she does it with a spear that she carries, that actually is a symbol of the power of our sexual creative energy. Yeah, our sexual creative energy is creative, but it's also destructive, depending on how we use it, right? So when we use the sexual energy to create, our existential bodies is creative. But when we do that effort to observe ourselves, to discover our psychological defects, and we ask that powerful forces of our consciousness, Divine Mother, disintegrate that defect or eliminate that defect, dissolve that defect, however you feel like commending so, then that sexual creative energy, yeah, like a spear, will be directed by that inner force to disintegrate that psychological defects. That is why whenever we notice even the small detail of the ego manifesting in ourselves, we must turn inward and ask, my mother, kill that defect, disintegrate it with your spear. And she will do so because that is her mission, to help us free ourselves from all our psychological elements. And well, when we begin to observe ourselves sincerely, when we recognize and judge our negative ways of being, this divine aspect of our inner nature awakens, right? It comes into activity. And as we call upon her to disintegrate the eyes that we observe, we start to feel the power that she has. And we are going to begin to witness the great inner changes that will start unfolding within us. And well, having understood this part of our consciousness and our essence and how they work, let's take a closer look at what the technique of the details actually is. This practice will allow us to sharpen our self observation and to move forward more quickly and effectively in the process of psychological death. Sorry. So to understand how this technique of the details works, we can compare our ego and its way of functioning to something very familiar to us, which is a tree. And the structure of a tree. Actually, if we look at that structure of any tree, we are going to notice something very interesting. While the tree is held upright by its thick main roots, those aren't actually the ones who feed it. Their purpose is different. They just anchor the tree. They hold its weight. They keep the tree from toppling when the winds blow. Actually, the ones that feed the tree are very tiny roots. Some delicate, almost hair-like roots that spread throughout the soil. They are the ones that absorb the sap, absorb the nutrients that keeps the tree alive. And well, That is exactly how the ego functions in us and in all humanity. We can compare the ego of a person to a large tree. The thick roots that support that tree represents our capital defects. Lust, greed, anger, pride, envy, and so on. These are like the main structure of the ego. They are often called the heads of legion or the deadly sins, right? And just as with the three, the tiny roots that feed the tree are what represents the details of those psychological defects, of those head of legions, those subtle, everyday manifestations of the ego in us. Yeah? These details are the countless small ways in which our psychological defects express themselves moment by moment in ourselves. They appear in our emotions, in what we feel. They whisper things in our mind. They also manifest through our thoughts. Those thoughts that arise constantly. That can come, for example, from envy. That can come from greed. That can come from depression. That can come from laziness. Whatever. But those are little details. So those are the ways in our minds how that defect is actually manifesting. They show themselves in all our mechanical reactions of our body, for example, in the word we speak, in the way we act. Often this manifestation seems so small, so subtle, that we don't even recognize those manifestations as defects. They are just like normal for us. But if we observe carefully, right, we are going to see how these small details are what are actually nourishing and sustaining the bigger defects. The ego, the main defects in us, right, are actually feeding on them. And we don't realize how much energy is being stolen from us by these constant little expressions moment by moment. For example, sarcasm. Sarcasm may seem harmless, yet if we look deeper behind a sarcastic expression, a sarcastic comment, we may find, for example, that there is within pride, superiority, criticism, rejection, and so on, right? We might notice a stream of negative thoughts. At first, they seem insignificant, just thoughts. But in reality, they are quietly feeding, for example, fear, for example, self pity, envy, and so on. Or let's say that we are impatient about something, right? When we observe that impatience carefully in each of our centers, there is many manifestations, many small manifestations that are actually what are giving strength, life, and power over us to that defect of impatience or of intolerance or of a resentment, right? You see how each small expression of this starts keeping, for example, our anger alive, right? Because there are big defects and they are details, and there are big details and there are small details, but all those details are what make up that big ego. Or let's take lust, for example. Very small details of lust, such as morbid curiosity or fantasizing about sexual things, or the habit of consuming obscene content, right? Each one is a small root feeding that large defect, right? Even something small, let's say in the case of greed, picking up a coin that doesn't belong to us. That is a detail that we hardly notice that actually is feeding greed. Okay? So when we begin to see that each of our defects is continually being nourished by countless small details, and all of these together sustain the great tree of the ego, then we may understand how do we need to start working on the details if we really want to dissolve completely what is known as our psychological I or ego in order for our consciousness, what is trapped within that ego, begins to express, begins to grow in us so that we can become 100% conscious beings, right? And that is why our task or our main task is to sharpen our self observation so that we can notice more and more of those little details that constantly goes like normal in us, especially the small subtle ones, because as we observe and we work on them, we gain the power to disintegrate any negative way of being of ourselves. And sometimes these details are even more deceptive because many times they disguise themselves as if they were good things, right? Or as if they were even consciousness. They appear in us as good intentions, as something socially acceptable, but when we examine these details closely, we realize that they are still defects. Only that they are being filtered through our personality, through the image that we want others to see, or through the concepts that we have absorbed along our lives, but they don't come from real understanding of our consciousness. So these very good subtle details are like the hardest one for us to discover. But when we start judging ourselves honestly from moment to moment, we start discovering also those part of the ego that are in the good side. Okay, so let's take an example to better understand this idea of the details using the defect of greed. Okay, what is greed? Greed is that psychological I within us that, on the one hand, driven by desire, always wants to have more so that it can waste, right? So that we can waste. And on the other hand, motivated by fear, greed is always afraid of lacking something, right? That is why greed lives in a constant state of wanting to accumulate more and more. Yeah. Now, if we look closely, we can identify some of its bigger details. For instance, the ambitious I. That is the part in us that creates plans, projects, desires in order to obtain more than what we actually need, right? Another major detail of greed is the thief, right? The thief eye. This is the part of greed that trying to satisfy its desire, takes what doesn't belong to us, right? And this can show itself in very subtle ways. As I was saying, picking up a coin that doesn't belong to us, right? Or taking a pen that isn't ours and keeping it. Something so small as that is actually a detail of the thief, right? Wow, we can find justifications for doing so, but actually those justifications are themselves small details of that same eyes. I don't know, justifications just like if I don't take it, someone else will do so. Or, oh my god, I was needing that so much. Or I learned something that I don't return it back. And I justify myself by saying that person doesn't need that anyway. So I am just justifying my thieving eye, right? But there are also other details of greed that seems good on the surface, right? But when we observe and we actually judge them, we find that they also belong to greed and directly or indirectly feed greed. For example, worrying about not having enough money to pay for a certain thing, right? We may think that this worry is consciousness, that actually worrying about that is being responsible. But in reality, these are simply concepts of personality. And they actually hide a series of small details such as complaint, frustration, fear, comparison, envy, anxiety, victimization, lack of acceptance, giving money and material things too much importance, lack of trust in our inner being, which is our sustainer, right? And our true provider. And well, or that sense of self sufficiency, right? Also fits there. And we fail to see that each of these details is quietly stealing huge amounts of our energy. Yeah. And worse, they are indirectly feeding the greedy eye, which remains obsessed with material things, and because of this, right, he leaves us without the courage, the time, the energy that we need to dedicate ourselves to the real work that we came here to do, which is awakening our consciousness. And so, in the same way, we can discover countless details behind every defect. And the key is that we learn to expand our self-observation capacity, right? To carefully discover in us each of these details that manifest, so saying, from moment to moment, and then be asking from moment to moment mentally our divine mother to disintegrate each one of these little details. And well, let's remember that within us there are many psychological defects, and it is these defects that have trapped our consciousness. Okay, that is why we must begin observing ourselves carefully so that we can discover the thousands of details that make up these defects. And what are we going to observe? We are going to be observing at all times our mind, our heart, and our sex, right? We must begin to observe in our mind what we are thinking, right? Our mind is where psychological defects are. They are talking all the time. So we must be observing every thought that arises within us. Sorry, it means becoming aware also of all the fantasies, of all the projections, of all the memories that comes, and try to figure out what are the psychological defects that are there manifesting. Maybe we are remembering something, and who is there remembering is jealousy, or is, for example, sadness, depression, there taking us from out from the present moment to go there to the past, to remember, to feel sorry about us, to be bad about what happens, and there that defect is stealing the energy from us, right? We also must be observing our times, our heart. So we are going to be observing our emotions, all the emotions that manifest from us, in us, from moment to moment. And in those emotions, we find, let's say, good emotions and bad emotions, like and dislikes. And there we need, if we judge ourselves, we are going to discover the details of the ego that are there manifesting. Maybe we're feeling good, but actually the one feeling good is lost, or the one feeling good is, for example, pride, or in the one feeling bad right now, for example, is, I don't know, envy, right? And only if we observe those emotions we can discover those psychological defects that are there manifesting. And also we must be observing our sexual parts, right, which is closely connected with both our instinct and our motor activities. In all these areas, we can find the small or the large details of the ego, and with the help of our own divine mother, we can eliminate them all. So, what we are really doing is like cutting off the food supply to that tree of the ego by removing the tiny roots that are actually sustaining it. And these roots are all those negative details, harmful thoughts, the hatred we may feel, the envy that we carry toward others, ambition, lies, words spoken with pride, for example. All these details are actually sustaining the ego. And so, if we are serious about our inner work, we must begin disintegrating them. And in this way, the tree of the ego will begin to lose its nourishment. It will stop growing and eventually it will dry up. And as that happens, something marvelous will start to happen within us, and that is that another tree will flourish within us, which is the inner tree of consciousness, which represents the wisdom of our being. And this tree will begin to develop, to grow, and to gain strength within us. And well, throughout this work, of the ego, we are going to be acquiring what is called scientific testing. Sorry, which is a purification of our sexual energy. That will be achieved by bringing balance to our energy centers by practicing a right feeling, a right thinking, a right speaking, and a right acting. Right? So when we reach this balance, our sexual energy becomes pure, and with that purity, when we practice suprasex with our partner, the sacred fire of the Kundalini can be ignited within our spine, and this will allow us to enter the path of the initiation, and that will allow us to begin the creation of our internal bodies. And at the same time, the death of the ego also opens the door for us to love humanity. Because in order to truly love others, we must begin by truly loving ourselves, and not in an egoistical way, of loving ourselves, of loving our ego, but by loving our consciousness. Okay? By valuing our consciousness, and also by demonstrating that love through the love through humanity can only be shown in the works we do, to free ourselves and to help humanity to free themselves by giving them the tools, right? And when we do this, we are rewarded with wisdom, because wisdom, when we give wisdom, we receive wisdom back, and wisdom will allow us to serve, to guide, and to help others more and more effectively, right? And well, also we must understand that what we are teaching here is not meant to remain as theory at all. It is something to be lived, something to be practiced, right? Wherever you go, wherever you are, at work, at home, performing any activity, pay attention. Pay attention to your mind, pay attention to your heart, and pay attention to your sex. These are the three main channels through which every defect manifests itself. And when you notice a defect expressing itself in any of those centers in that very moment, make the request to your Divine Mother to disintegrate it. That is the key. And you are going to begin to notice the marvelous transformation that is going to be taking place in your inner world. And well, I sincerely hope that today's conference has been clear, and that it inspires you to practice this powerful technique of the detail. If you apply it, you will begin to see profound changes within yourself and in your lives. Anyways, if something is not clear, feel free to leave your comments, leave your questions. Remember that if you are not yet part of our WhatsApp or Telegram groups, where you can receive complementary materials on any of these lectures, you can find the link to join our groups here in the description of this video. And we will gladly solving any question that you have. And well, in our next conference of the phase A, we are going to be exploring a very, very interesting topic. We are going to be knowing what is the real meaning of the Christ, right? We are going to see what that force is, right? And how many masters around this race have incarnated this force. We are going to be learning what is the universal Christ and what is the individual Christ. And we are going to see the possibilities that we all have of incarnating that state of consciousness that is to Christ. And well, that will be the next lecture. And thank you. Thank you very much to all of you who are here. watching these lectures. Feel free to share them so that we can reach more and more people with this knowledge. And well, thank you very much and have a nice rest of the day. Bye bye.